Good afternoon from Manila, and good morning and evening for those joining us from different time zones. Thank you for joining and welcome to the consultation on safeguards in private sector operations. This is part of ADB's ongoing safeguard policy review and update process. And in the 19th of the 20 sets of regional consultations planned for the phase 2 of policy review process. My name is Gelson Garcia, your overall moderator for this consultation. This is the session with the civil society stakeholders in South Asia and Central and West Asia. We have more than 70 registered participants today, and about 50 are from outside ADB or our external stakeholders. 13 countries are represented, mostly by CSO stakeholders from Central and West Asia and South Asia, followed by Pacific, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and the rest are from the US and Canada. In this consultation, the ADB will present its safeguards for private sector operations. And later, we would like to hear your comments and inputs on the following. How does ADB safeguards apply to private sector operations and their financing instruments? What are the findings from the independent evaluation department on its implementation challenges, the strengths and recommendations? How does ADB compare with peer multilateral financing institutions or MFIs when ADB did a benchmarking study for this policy review? And what are the key issues for considerations as ADB reflects and consults for the strengthening of safeguards in private sector operations? As such, your participation in this consultation is timely and important. And also, thank you for bearing with us on the rescheduling of this consultation. We're finally doing it before the end of the year. Before I call on our speakers, here's a few gentle meeting reminders. Please join from a quiet, distraction-free area. Please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. During the question and answer time, you may ask questions by typing them in chat box or raising your hand. We will then ask you to unmute and turn on your camera so we can ask you your questions live. Also, please be respectful to everyone. We will manage our time to keep it within our schedule, and IT support is provided. So you may ask for support by typing on the chat box. As you're joining by Zoom, here's a few guidance when using important buttons. Simultaneous interpretation is available. You may click the globe icon found in the lower part of your screen and select preferred language. Please press the mute original button or audio button so you can clearly hear the interpretation. In this consultation, Hindi, Urdu, and Russian interpretations are available. We also ask that you use your proper name in Zoom for our documentation. To change your name on Zoom, click on the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And on the right hand of your screen, look for your name. Click on the More button on the right side of your name. Click on the Rename button, type in your name and agency, then click OK. If you wish to send a message, question, or feedback, click the chat button. If you wish to comment or raise a question live in the language you prefer, please click on the smile icon or reactions button and then click on raise hand. To speak and unmute yourself, click on the microphone icon. To show your video, click on the video icon. We value diverse and informed feedback from a wide range of stakeholders. So allow me to restate ADB's commitment to meaningful consultations. The Safeguard Policy Review and Update for Phase 2 consultations provide opportunities for stakeholders to express their views and opinions on ADB's environmental and social safeguards in the most meaningful and safest manner possible. All stakeholders are encouraged to articulate their inputs and concerns during these consultation sessions. By joining these sessions, stakeholders are considering are consenting to the video and audio recording of these consultations in their subsequent release. ADB will prepare consultation summaries and disclose them publicly. This will ensure the accuracy and transparency of proceedings. Stakeholders wishing to exclude themselves from such recordings are asked to contact the Safeguard Policy Review and Update Secretariat at safeguardsupdate@adb.org within 2 weeks of this session to share the exceptions and exclusions. The recordings and documentation allow the ADB to review, consider, and respond to, if necessary, any comments and inputs made. Background materials on the thematic areas have been released in preparation for the consultations and dialogues. All types of feedback are welcome. This will not be used for the purposes of retaliation, abuse, or any kind of discrimination. If you have any issues or concerns on the disclosure, recordings, confidentiality, potential risks, abuse, or any kind of discrimination during the consultations, or wish to exclude yourself from the recording events and discussion, please again contact us. In this consultation, we have 2 hours, and here's how we plan to maximize our consultation time. First, we'll have welcome remarks from Bruce Dunn, the Director of Safeguards Division at SDSS, to give us an overview of private sector operations under ADB safeguards and IAD findings, as well as, to give us a welcome remark. And then it will then be followed by an overview of the private sector operations under ADB SPS 2009 and the IAD findings from Mr. Mark Conzer, the Director of Private Sector Transaction Support Division, or PSTS, at the Private Sector Operations Department of the ADB. Then we'll turn to Mr. Felix Uku, the Senior Social Development Specialist for Safeguards, also under SDCC, for Safeguards Division, to lead the session on the key comparisons with other MFIs. We'll pause for a 5-minute break. Then after that, we go to session number 3, which is the exciting part, the moderated discussion for 17 minutes, led by Mr. Richard Sherrington, the Principal Safeguard Specialist of the Private Sector Transaction Support Division of PSOD. We'll then have a quick event evaluation using Mendy. Then finally, we'll end with a wrap-up and synthesis from Director Bruce Dunn. As such, and without further ado, I would like to call Director Dunn for his welcome remarks. Bruce?
Thank you very much, Gelson. Hi, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. It's been a little while since we've last had some of these regional consultations, and we had actually put on hold, as you know, these 2 last consultations in the regional series, the consultation on safeguards for the private sector, and also somewhat of a sister event on financial intermediaries. We're going ahead today with the private sector, but we have actually rescheduled the financial intermediaries one until early next year. The key reason, to be honest with that, is the team's been pretty active. We've been going through a series of in-country consultations over the last 2 months, doing somewhat of a roadshow with many of our developing member countries and civil society organizations in those countries. And we just needed a little bit more time, honestly. We've been focusing a lot quite recently on the early work in drafting the first of the environmental and social policy and also the initial standards. But on some of the work on financial modalities, we still have a bit of work to go. Not to worry, though, there will still be sufficient time to come to those topics, to reflect on them, and then integrate them into the policy. As I'll mention a little bit later in my introduction, we are looking at some updates to the schedule and a little bit more time extension before we go to the release of the first draft of the policy and ADB's discussions with our board. So this will allow sufficient time to come to some of these topics before we move to the next stage. Now, in this just sort of brief opening remarks, what I wanted to do was to share actually a bit more of an update with you on where we currently stand in the process and what we're currently looking at. And then I'll be handing over to my colleagues, Mark Kunzer and Felix Oku, to talk on more specifics on the private sector. So if we now go to the first of my slides for the introduction, what I wanted to share with you here is a bit more of an update on the approach, methodology, and timetable. My apologies for some of you that would have joined recent country consultations. You may have seen this, but for others that have not recently joined us, I hope this will be useful for you. The first here is you'll see that we have actually made quite a bit of progress. We started with the background information paper in 2020 and the stakeholder engagement plan. We then went on to a series of analytical studies, and we've actually completed 18 of those. And the last one that's actually remaining for us to publish or discuss is on financing modalities. So as I mentioned, that's being planned now for early next year. We've had a long and very productive set of consultations, and I'll come to this in some of the future slides. But it's been very rich, and we've got a lot of inputs which are now feeding into the first draft of the policy. You can see here that we're actually aiming for a working paper discussion with ADB's board in March 2023, and then a final ADB board approved paper, the new policy, by October 2023. Now, this is still to be confirmed, but we are actually now discussing an extended timetable to allow us a bit more time to complete these remaining pieces, including on the financing modalities aspects. So we'll be going back to you fairly soon and updating the website. We're actually looking potentially about pushing these dates back by about 3 months. So that's the current schedule. Once we do finally go through to ADB's board, however, we would then be looking at a policy rollout period. The new policy would become effective 12 months after the policy is actually approved by the board. So, for example, if it's approved at the end of 2023, the new policy would then become effective at the end of 2024, 1 year later. So that's the overall schedule. If we go to the next slide, you'll see on this one is a list of the analytical studies and the previous regional consultation topics that we've completed. You'll see there a list of 18 different topics with one additional planned study and consultation to be released early next year. For those of you that haven't seen these, you can scan the QR code and that will take you to the studies. Plus, from the previous consultations, all the presentation materials and consultation materials are available. If we go to the next slide, just to give you a summary of the consultation data. So far we've had actually about 100 consultation events, individual consultation events with our developing member countries across Asia and the Pacific, with civil society organizations, with our private sector clients, and also with project affected people for, I think so far, 7 different projects in different countries across the region. And in total, more than 2,800 participants have been involved in those. We've had representation from 55 of ADB's 68 member countries, plus a number of other countries from outside of the region. We've had 56 private sector companies involved in focus group discussions, plus I think in total about 400 to 500 project affected people that have been involved in those consultations. You can see also that roughly civil society and our developing member countries are quite equally represented in those sessions, about just under 40% of each of those. We've also in the past few months been doing follow-ups to the regional events that we've held online, where we've had a series of in-country consultations with 9 countries that you can see listed there. Tonga, Papua New Guinea, Mongolia, the People's Republic of China, Pakistan, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, India, and Indonesia. and we have a 10th country planned for the beginning of next year in Georgia. We've picked up these countries to try and provide some representation across the different regions, also looking at countries of different socioeconomic development status, and also including countries like small island developing states in the region. So fairly broad. Overall, we've got a lot of very useful inputs into the process, and we've had some fairly positive feedback from the consultations. And like in other sessions today, we'll be reaching out to get your feedback. We'll be doing an evaluation at the end of the session and also sending you a follow-up evaluation. You may also be wondering about how we're documenting these sessions. We're in the process of finalizing consultation summaries from the past events, which will be going up onto our website, and we'll be making that available. Plus, we'll also be preparing a full consultation summary that will form part of the board consideration documents and will be disclosed on ADB's website. Now, where are we going? So we'll go up to the next slide. You'll see here, and I just want to give you a quick overview in terms of how we are looking at the policy structure. Some of you will know that have been involved with ADB for many years. The existing safeguard policy statement is divided into three main areas. This is environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous people safeguards. And there are some overarching policy objectives, and then there are policy requirements for each of those three areas. The new policy structure, we're looking to converge on a structure that's fairly similar to most of the other multilateral development banks. That will start with a policy vision statement, which will align how the safeguards link to and support global and regional priorities, like the Sustainable Development Goals and a range of others, for example, the Paris Agreement on climate change. Then if you look down to the second tier on this diagram, there will be the environmental and social policy of the ADB, and this will be supported by the environmental and social standards. We're looking at a set of what we expect to be 9 or 10 standards, plus additional requirements for financing modalities, and that's a piece that we're still working on. The policy will then be supported by more detailed procedural and organizational arrangements, and also all of the standards will have guidance notes, and we will also be preparing a lot of detailed capacity building, awareness, and training materials. So that's the overall framework. Now, of course, as we move to today's topic, we do need to look at how this policy framework is fit for purpose and adapted to different needs. ADB works in both the public sector with our developing member countries, with financing through to the sovereign governments, and sometimes down to state governments or local jurisdictions within a country. We also work directly with the private sector and with our private sector clients. And we have a range of modalities that we use, including things like financial intermediaries and corporate finance, as well as our policy support and results-based lending. So we are looking at how the policy should be tailored and customized to those different aspects. And today, we're going to have some time to focus on the private sector aspects of that. So with that as background, I'll now finish up, and we'll pass over next to my colleague, Mark Kunze, who's going to start talking more about the overview of the private sector operations under the existing safeguards. So thanks a lot, and over to you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin with a very quick refresher on the structure of the current policy and how it deals with private sector operations. I think a lot of people will be very familiar with this, so I'm going to go through it quite quickly. There are three main policy areas: environment, involuntary resettlement, and Indigenous peoples. And there are also three overarching policy objectives, which I'll quickly summarize. And they are to avoid adverse impacts where possible, minimize, mitigate, and/or compensate when avoidance is not possible, and to also help our borrowers strengthen their systems and build capacity. Other key requirements are Appendix 4, which covers a number of private sector requirements such as lending to financial intermediaries and corporate finance. And sometimes forgotten, but equally as important, is the prohibited investment activities list, which is included as Appendix 5. Next slide, please. So where do we find the private sector requirements in the policy? The bulk of the policy deals with project finance, and safeguard requirements 1 to 3 apply to both private sector and sovereign lending. Private sector deals often provide finance for improvements to existing facilities, and these deals require that an environmental and social audit be undertaken. The key requirement for financial intermediary transactions are that the client develops an appropriate environmental and social management system, unless of course their lending will have no adverse social or environmental risks, in which case this doesn't apply. So for corporate finance, there are 2 requirements. Again, the client is required to develop an ESMS, and if the loan will be used to finance specific projects, then the safeguard requirements for environment, social and indigenous people requirements will be applied. Just a quick note here that private sector financing does not involve program or sector lending. We don't do multi-tranche finance facilities or emergency loans. However, we will be talking about some PSOD programs in the next slide or 2, but those are not program loans in the terminology that ADB uses. Next slide, please. So ADB considers that evaluation is essential to increasing the effectiveness of our development assistance. And so we have an independent evaluation department, which reviews all aspects of our operations, from policies through to evaluations of individual projects. In April 2020, IED published an evaluation of the safeguards policy and how ADB's operations had implemented it from the period 2010 to 2018. I'd like to take a little time now to go over some of the key findings of that report. And if you're interested, you can also find this report online at the ADB IED webpage. But first, a little background. The ADB safeguards policy was 10 years old in 2018 when the evaluation was undertaken. And during that time, ADB's business continued to grow both in dollar terms, increasing from 16 billion in 2009 to 31 billion in 2020. And there were also increases in the number of approved projects. At the same time, private sector lending also increased significantly, from just 14% of ADB's lending in 2009 to today, where the private sector department is moving towards a target of 30% of the bank's total business. So let me begin by going through some of the highlights of the evaluation. As the private sector business here at ADB has increased, so has our development and use of new financing approaches, such as promoting the development of the green bond market in Asia, the establishment of our trade finance and supply chain finance programs, and our role as an anchor investor in various public share offerings. ADB's Strategy 2030 sets a target for private sector operations to bring in $2.50 of co-financing for every $1 that we lend. And this crowding in requirements means that we're regularly partnering with other IFIs. And the IED evaluation highlights the needs for better harmonization of policies with our partners. In the private sector department, we also spend a lot of time working with our clients on developing or improving their environmental and social management systems. This effort is appreciated, and we have a strong focus on the management of labour and working conditions too. We've also supported our FI partners in the same way. And in addition, we have an annual audit program in place for our FI clients. Now, audits are not generally appreciated, but our FI clients see them as more of a training opportunity than as a compliance visit. Next slide, please. So let me now go through some of the shortcomings highlighted in the report. As I mentioned earlier, the SBS has a strong focus on infrastructure projects, and the policy is not well adapted or customized to support private sector financing. I mentioned earlier some of the new financing approaches such as IPOs and bonds, and as these have emerged, they've had limited safeguards guidance to support them. Also, the policy doesn't recognise differences between sovereign and private sector operations in both culture and practice. One of the key differences here is the private sector's entry point into the project cycle. This is usually much later than for our sovereign projects. So private sector projects may have already established procedures which may or may not be consistent with our policy requirements. They may have completed part of the regulatory environmental impact assessment process, and in some cases even started construction. So this does not allow much room for meaningful consultation or design adjustments when we're arriving so late in the project cycle. In the last slide, we highlighted that PSOD has done good work with our FI clients. However, there's still some way to go, as the evaluation found that managing safeguards in FI projects is incomplete at both policy and delivery levels. One final point on this slide, important for private sector operations, is regarding ADB disclosure requirements. The 120-day disclosure period for Category A projects is well out of alignment with our other partner MFIs, and I'll come back to that in a later slide. Next slide, please. So the overall assessment of private sector operations is that our safeguards performance is as good as or better than sovereign projects. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but instead I'll give you my personal view as to why this might be. So firstly, project preparation. In the private sector, we require our clients to pay for the preparation of the required environmental and social documents and assessments. This means our clients are free to hire the major environmental and social consultancies to do this work. Our colleagues in the sovereign departments often don't have this option, as the project preparation is funded by ADB through grant financing, and our cost ceilings often preclude the use of the major consultancy firms. In my view, this results in private sector projects getting a better standard of E&S documents. Moving on to project implementation, I'd suggest that performance here is guided by two factors. These are the commitment of PSOD specialists to getting our projects to deliver the expected development impacts, and also the leverage we have with our clients. Our clients are able to react faster and more nimbly than government departments or implementing agencies, and are also very dependent on the ADB finance to keep a project moving. This leverage allows us to achieve effective project implementation, and I think we have an advantage over our sovereign colleagues here. The final point is again commitment and how it relates to capacity and training. The private sector department here at ADB is very unlikely to work with clients that don't share our vision and goals. If they're reluctant to adopt our environmental and social requirements, we're even more reluctant to lend to them. So our clients' commitment to ESG means that they're usually very receptive to training and capacity building. Next slide, please. So let me try and summarize the recommendations of the evaluation with respect to private sector operations. Harmonization with other MFIs is a key requirement. As we are out of sync with our partners and we're the slowest IFI with our processing times, this is vital. We require shorter disclosure periods, as the 120-day rule is twice as long as our co-financing partners. We agree that there's more guidance needed for both staff and clients, and along with that, there needs to be regular training and updates to supporting materials. And we definitely agree that we need more staff to enable us to more efficiently prepare and implement projects, with a particular emphasis on more supervision. So with that, let me hand you on to the next presenter, to Felix, to provide you with a comparison of where we sit with our partner IFIs. So Felix, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and Bruce, for the introductory presentations. And if I borrow your last concluding sentence there, Mark, harmonization is a key requirement. In the spirit of harmonization, as part of the safeguards update process, ADB has conducted a comparative study with the sister institutions or peer comparator institutions to gauge how we compare in terms of safeguards management and overall safeguard policy architecture. So in the next couple of slides, I think 4 or so, I'll try to explain how we compare with our sister institutions in terms of our safeguard policy. It'll be covering key safeguard issues that we've benchmarked against our sister institutions, our peer institutions, and how we have identified key safeguard issues that we should progress for consideration as part of the policy update. Our safeguard policy update had looked at other sister institutions that compare quite favorably with us in terms of business model. In some limited instance, like the IFC and the EBRD, we've looked at areas where there are cross linkages, or we co-finance in same regional coverage. And next slide, please. So with this first slide, which we'll spend a few minutes on, we'll look at the sister institutions that I think we quite compare very favorably with in terms of business model. And if we look at the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, we look at the EBRD, a comparatively similar regional bank that does both sovereign and private sector operations. But we also have overlapping regional coverage within our central and west region. Then we have IDB Invest, which is the private sector arm of IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, in that case. The fact is that we've done our comparative study on benches or hinges on policy, a framework or the policy, the year when it was approved, the architecture, which I think Bruce alluded to in his earlier presentation. We've also looked at, in terms of coverage and scope, the various kinds of financing instruments or modalities that are applicable to the safeguard policies across the comparator institutions. Then we've touched on the policy design, how the policy manages safeguards process as well, the whole process of assessment of environmental and social risks and impact throughout the policy implementation, how the policy or various policies categorizes projects, and the scales or ratings that are assigned to the risks and impact of potential projects. So we start with the policy update. So ADB Safeguard Policy Statement, adopted in 2009, well over a decade ago. Is ADB's safeguards. Then we go to the IFC sustainability framework, of which the performance standard is a component of, emerged and that was approved June 2012. Then we have the EBRD Environment and Social Policy, recently updated in 2019. Then an IDB Invest, also Environment and Social Policy Framework, 2020. In terms of the policy architecture, all the selected policy are 3 benchmarked against the ADB SPS, have a overarching policy statement. ADB's own is benchmarked, is integrated, so partly you could talk about that. It covers also quality standards. IFC has one, EBRD also has, and an IDB Invest also has one. In terms of financing instruments, It covers across the three safeguards, IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest both covers the three main business areas of private sector operations, talking about loans, debt, and or guarantees, and the complexities that come with various combinations of that. With the ADB SPS, as Mark alluded to, we have a special requirement section, which is SR4, and that touches on various financing instruments or modalities, but it's leaned a lot more towards infrastructure and public sector investment of public sector lending activities. Under SR4, you do have financing instruments such as general corporate finance, under which corporate finance is alluded to. You have also financing intermediaries, which are applicable to our private sector operations. Then we have existing facilities, which is not really a financing modality, but yet is a way or a structural financing or status of safeguard implementation of which SR4 also applies, and that applies extensively to our private sector projects. Project finance and the limited recourse financing is also part of it. So that's quite part, big chunk of private sector operations. In terms of policy design, SPS compares quite very largely with our sister institutions being principle-based, with a marked difference that our sister institutions, IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest, are both underpinned by detailed guidance, which provide prescriptive requirements of what the objective and requirements are for the principles base. So for IFC performance standards, for instance, you have guidance note, which goes into various details, various sections and paragraphs of the policy itself and explains what the standard requirements are and provides clarity for the client and borrowers. Same applies with EBRD performance requirements as well. In terms of safeguards management, the SPS is deemed to be much more front-loaded than its comparator institutions like the IFC, EBRD, or IDB Invest. Front-loaded in the sense that a lot of the safeguards assessment or requirements are meant to be achieved, completed for implementation prior to board approval. With the IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest having a compliance over time or adaptive mechanism via the environmental social action planning process, which enables safeguards actions that are not completed prior to board approval to be pushed for implementation or completion following board approval. In terms of assessment for ENS risk and impact, ADB has three safeguards: the environment safeguard, we've got the involuntary settlement safeguard, and a safeguard for indigenous peoples, both of which are assessed independently, categorized also independently. With IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest, the overarching safeguard standard, which is the safeguard standard usually 1, performance standard 1, or performance requirement 1, is where most of the standards are integrated. And that forms the entry point to the assessment and categorization of each of the standards in terms of their applicability for further assessment. I've already mentioned that project categorization for ADB SPS is separate for 3 safeguards. For the other comparator institutions, these are all well integrated. Classification, ADB, for the 3 safeguards, we use ABC. And then we have a special denotation for the highly complex and sensitive notation for unique type of projects. FI is another unique categorization, but we have another set which is FI treated at C. For IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest, there is a separate categorization for FI, but then that's also further subdivided into FI1, FI2, FI3, which aligns quite very well with your typical ABC sort of projects. IDB Invest has aligned the ABC as well to align with World Bank's high, substantial, medium, and low risk categories. Next slide, please, Gelson. Jude. We look at stakeholder engagement throughout the project cycle, and ADB, we don't have a standard in that perspective. It's enshrined within the project requirement and preparatory process for public participation and consultation. IFC does have its EBRD and IDB Invest. Instrument required for FIs is still the environment and social management system. That's the benchmark. Additional requirement for FIs. FI are categorized, as I explained, separately for IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest. That said, IFC has not got a separate standard. Let me make that clear. For safeguards, but it has an interpretation note. The interpretation note does provide all the clarity in terms of the categorization, borrower's requirement for FI. Adaptive mechanisms or adaptive approach to management of safeguards issues is not applicable for the ADB SPS. I've explained already that that is applicable for our sister institutions via various mechanisms in their safeguards review, management, and implementation processes. Marcus already alluded the kind of discrepancy that exists in terms of disclosure requirements for our projects between ADB and our peer institutions like the IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest. For Category A projects, we have 120 disclosure requirement prior to board approval, whereas our sister peer institutions do have 60. Location of disclosure requirement for SPS, para 20, access to information policy 2019, effective 1st January, I think, is the one that mainstreams disclosure and location ADB webpage. IFCSO has mentioned as part of its sustainability framework and access to information policy 2012. There is similarly access to policy. So ADB quite very benchmark, quite very nicely with our sister institutions in terms of access to information and policy governance. The next two slides will follow following this benchmark work that we've done. The key safeguards issues that we have scheduled for further consideration and review as part of the SPS update. In terms of safeguard categorization, as I've mentioned, is a key difference between ADB SPS and our peer institutions in that we have three safeguards, separate safeguards, which is quite distinctly different from our sister institutions that have integrated approach to safeguards with separate standards. So ADB aims to align with other MFI safeguard frameworks, consider overlaps with cross-cutting and thematic issues, and provide clearer provisions on requirement for private sector operations. There are a lot of private sector operations which our current SPS has restrictions on it in terms of implementation. Then in terms of improvement for safeguard, for stakeholder engagement, ADB is uniquely different in that our peer institutions have standards that look at safeguard, stakeholder engagement and participation. And there will be an area for ADB to propose standards that will encourage safeguard identification, project grievance systems, monitoring systems, stakeholder roles and responsibility, budget and training. They all require guidelines and good practice notes for applying the revised policy and due diligence, especially in our projects, which are quite very absent at the moment. In terms of information disclosure, it's recommended or be good if ADB align with other MFI for sovereign and private sector operations to achieve meaningful consultation prior to progressing projects for board consideration. We need to also strengthen regular disclosure to project affected persons beyond the current working arrangement in ADB. We can go to the next slide, Jude. We mentioned earlier on one of the difference between ADB and its sister institutions is the front loading. ID reports has also highlighted that oversight of project during implementation is a weakness in terms of safeguard implementation. It's important that ADB classifies ADB staff requirement for client borrower monitoring to ensure proper allocation of resources during project implementation. Strengthen ADB safeguards oversight and resources for monitoring safeguards implementation has also been identified as a key requirement. Guidance material has been one of the key differences that has been identified by the benchmarking exercise. Whereas if you look at peer institutions like the IFC, EBRD, and IDB Invest, that have safeguard policies underpinned by detailed guidance specifying what the borrower or the client's requirements are, as well as bank safeguard requirements are, ADB's SPS lacks that detailed guidance. So updated, improved guidance, toolkits, templates, and good practice notes for private sector operations, particularly for general corporate finance, FIs, and other financing instrument is deemed quite very critical. Mark mentioned the green bond, for example, where we think capital market transactions have evolved and private sector portfolio had evolved since adoption of the safeguard policy. So it's quite highly recommended that the SPS will adopt safeguards requirement that will mainstream innovative and new financing instruments which are currently used by PSOD, either in the form of debt, equity, or guarantee. We mentioned other areas such as the trade finance and supply chain program as well, which is an area that is incrementally gathering traction by PSOD, and other areas like corporate finance, not necessarily general corporate finance, but corporate finance in the forms of the three arms of transactions that I mentioned as well, which the safeguard policy statements need to catch up with. These are some of the key areas which have been identified as part of the comparative studies which have been done and are being currently being looked at, as hinted by Bruce in his introductory presentation, to be captured and framework by ADB to ensure that the new safeguard policy update, when completed, should be future-looking, very adaptive in terms of safeguard management, and ready to support ADB in its ambitious targets. I think this is where my presentation on the comparative study ends, and I'll hand back over to you, Gelson, to transition into the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you, Bruce, for giving us the overview and where we are on the safeguards policy in review process. Mark, on the refresher of the ADB safeguards for PSOs and the findings of the IED. And finally, Felix, for providing key comparisons between ADB private sector operations safeguards with those of other MFIs. So with these three presentations, I hope we have provided enough background information to prompt questions and specific comments. But before we move to our guided Q&A, which will later on be led by Richard, let's pause for a 5-minute break. It's time to get your coffee, water, or refresh or to powder your nose. And we'll have music played during the break. Once it's turned off, it means we should be ready for the open forum. So see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right, so welcome back. We'll then move to our next session, which is an equally important part of the consultation, and that is the moderated discussion. And let me now turn you to Mr. Richard Sherrington, the Principal Safeguard Specialist of the Private Sector Transaction Support Division of ADB's Private Sector Operations Department, to lead this conversation. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Gelson. I hope all of you can hear me clearly. As Gelson and some of my other colleagues have indicated, this typically, for those of you who have not joined these consultations before, should be the most interesting part of this particular process. So we've been allotted, I think, an hour or an hour and 15. And what I'm hoping we can achieve is to generate some good discussions on the process that we've undertaken so far, and any particular recommendations or concerns or questions that you might have about the process that's been undertaken so far, but also in the application of the SPS that we've been using to date, and any recommendations on how, with your experience with ADB's SPS, or indeed with the other IFIs and MDBs on their safeguards policies, how they've been applied, and what we might learn from you as observers and participants and stakeholders in both projects that we undertake, particularly in the private sector, but also as observers of the development process that we work with. So without further ado, I'm hoping I can open the floor to our participants from CSOs and NGOs in South Asia and Central and West Asia as well, to see what questions you have. So if I might ask someone to get the ball rolling. Any volunteers to kickstart the process? Perhaps then just to prompt, if there are any queries about the information that you've heard so far in terms of what Bruce spoke about in terms of the process that we've undertaken and the series of broad consultations that we've done across Asia and the Pacific, and then secondly, any comments or questions about what Mark told you about with regards to the results of the independent evaluation that was undertaken and some of the recommendations that we received, and also third, any comments or questions or clarifications on what we heard from Felix with regard to some of the results of the comparison and comparative analysis that we did with the other three comparator MDBs. Okay, so we did receive a few questions in advance. So without putting anyone, I'm not wishing to put anyone on the spot here, but one of the questions we received in advance was from UNI Asia and Pacific Regional Organization. And I think we do have one of the participants from this organization in the call. And just to summarize it, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Jayasri Priyalal, if you want to elaborate on the particular question that was submitted, which is with regard to ADB's adoption of the United Nations guideline framework for human and business rights and the protect, respect and remedy framework. If Jayasri, if you're there, if you care to just summarize your question for the other participants.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity and taking up my question.
Right.
Yeah, my question is, now when you from the since 2009, the ADB's lending portfolio for private sector has exponentially grown, and then we are also trying to move forward to expand the activities with by giving finances to private sector. So because in many cases, the private sector enterprises are required to commit to the United Nations Human and Business Rights, guidelines. So whether ADB, my question was, whether ADB's guideline framework will also fall in line with the requirements specified in the United Nations guiding principles on human and business rights. In addition to that, we would also, and of course, this is a second question, to get an idea as to how the ADB funding to the private sector. Now, we know in the sovereign sector, most of the funding goes to the infrastructure and various other things. What are the specific areas of the private sector operations that ADB funds have gone into, so that we can get an idea to how the financing has been done. So these are my concerns.
Thank you very much, Jayasri. Yeah, so there were two questions there, and I think what I'll do is just kick that one straight over to Bruce, who, as you heard earlier, is playing a key role in this process. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much, Jayasri. Really appreciate you joining today. It's a good question on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So we have been looking at this, and we have also received some submissions from the Office of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, also proposing and asking questions about how ADB might consider the guiding principles. First thing to say is we respect the importance of human rights, and it's certainly relevant. The key principles are very relevant to the work that we do and the context under which we operate. Our framework moving forward, we expect to have some recognition of human rights issues in the policy, but our preferred approach is to be able to translate some of the key principles that are relevant to the types of operations that ADB implements into the environmental and social safeguard framework. We do this because we need to have a very clear framework that can go into legal agreement with our clients in terms of exactly what our objectives are and exactly what the requirements that ADB expects them to follow are. And what we do need to ensure there is, in the context of the environmental and social safeguards remit and the standards that we're looking at for that, the key issues, say, for example, labor rights, things like child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, collective bargaining, or around meaningful stakeholder engagement and consultation, or health and safety for workers, or looking at property rights and those aspects. They need to be reflected very directly and very tangibly in the requirements that we set out. So that's the first thing that we're looking at. And we have actually asked the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for any specific feedback on very specifically, they see any areas that the ADB current safeguards, and then also when we have a draft of the new safeguards, if there are any key issues that they would see as being fundamentally missing or in conflict with our existing safeguards. So that's one thing that we're doing. That would provide a clear framework then for our borrowers and our clients to be able to follow and would go into the legal agreements. In addition to that, though, ADB, we've got screened all of the projects that we're going to consider for financing. We look at them in terms of their environmental and social risk profile. And we also need to look at them in terms of the context under which those projects are being implemented. Are those projects, for example, in a conflict-affected area where there are security risks? Are they in areas where there might be certain allegations of human rights violations, say around labor? We had for many years, for example, around issues of child labor in the cotton industry in Uzbekistan, or it could be in other sectors and countries. Does that context exist? Are there conditions under which meaningful consultation could be undertaken, or are we receiving concerns or evidence that there may be retaliation against stakeholders? This is the sort of context which we're looking to try and understand. So in addition to the normal types of environmental and social risks that we look at, for example, what type of environmental impacts might a project have, maybe air emissions, water emissions. We're looking to bring into this these contextual factors so that we can be aware of it, and then we can also make decisions about financing. We can work with the clients around addressing those issues, or if necessary, we may have to take corrective actions if issues occur during implementation. So that's currently what we're thinking of in terms of sort of how we might address consistency with the UN guiding principles. Let me stop there, because I've said a few things, and John, you might have some further points or clarifications based on that. I'll pass back to you, Richard.
Yeah, thanks. What I'll do, if you don't mind, Bruce and Jayasri, is maybe just double check with Jayasri if he's clear on that response, or if he requires any clarification.
Yeah, I appreciate. Thank you very much. For your interest, and I can understand the line in which you are trying to see how to bring the compliances or falling in line with the UN human and business rights. Because my particular concern is this. Yes, mostly we address issues on environmental and social issues, but the governance factor is something very important when it comes to private sector transactions, activities as well. So that is why I thought that to give a little bit prominence on this, the UN guiding principles. So I understand and I appreciate your concerns, and we hope that you will bring all those things in consultation with the UN agencies. But I would also like to emphasize that that the governance factors are also adequately reflected, so that we can see that most of our operations are very well balanced. So that's my response. Thank you.
Great. Maybe just something to add on to what Bruce said. We do actually have examples of projects. One that comes to mind is a project we covered in Laos, where the borrower was also borrowing from a commercial bank or an equator principal signatory. So within that process, we supported and were proactive in supporting the client undertake a human rights impact assessment, as we know is one of the new requirements under the latest equator principle guidance. And in addition to that, of course, as you'll note from the SPS 2009 and something that we're working to enhance in the revision of the policy is grievance mechanisms. And what we work quite hard on, particularly within the private sector, is both a grievance mechanism for community members to use, and also for workers and contractors to use as well. So you'll see that in a lot of our documentation if you look on adb.org. But yeah, I'll stop there. And I see a raised hand from Ashley McDonald. So Ashley, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Bruce and Richard and Felix, for that overview and presentation. I want to dig deeper into this human rights issue and focus on the issue on reprisals. For one of our questions here is that how is ADB planning or to prevent reprisals when it comes to carrying out human rights due diligence, and also with specific approach to private sector lending and financial intermediaries? That would be my first question, but I also have a follow-up on that. You mentioned that there is a requirement to the clients on due diligence on project level, and I would like to know how are the communities involved, the people impacted by the projects involved in this due diligence process. That's it from me.
Great, thanks, thanks, Ashley. What I'll do then is, I know this has been discussed quite extensively within the bank through this policy update, but perhaps Bruce, you might be best placed to answer that.
Sure, thank you. Thanks very much, Ashley, for joining and for those points. And Richard, let's also come back to some of the points from Jayasri as well. I think we may have missed
on the second question. Yeah.
But it's good if we get a dialogue going around some of these issues with other participants as well. So yeah, on reprisals. So this has been an issue that has been coming up quite consistently in the stakeholder consultations that we've been doing over the last year, and we've done topics, for example, dedicated around stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation, and grievance redress, and it's come up quite clearly in those, but also in other contexts. So that's one that we're quite aware of, and actually in the new policy context, we're starting to do some drafting now, and actually we are looking at putting some direct policy language around no tolerance for reprisals in the policy. I think that's a very important policy position that we need to make. We have, maybe some softer or incomplete language in the existing policy that talks about meaningful consultation, and that consultation should occur in an environment that's free of coercion or intimidation. But we want to go a step further than that and make a broader statement. We need to then look at how we can address risks in the context of projects. I want to be fair, though, that this is an issue that needs to be assessed. We need to do some due diligence around risk. We need to put in place some management measures and maybe have some recourse and remedial action that you might take. But it's probably something you can never fully ensure. So, it's really about how do you manage it, because, obviously you're working with third parties. But from our side, there's a few things that we need to do. Is one, assessing the context under which a project's being undertaken. We started to talk about that before, and doing our due diligence. That does involve engagement with communities. Any project needs to go through a process of meaningful consultation and stakeholder engagement to understand what are the risks and concerns of communities. And we have to also back that up with our own due diligence around, potential risks of reprisal. For example, in certain country contexts or under certain security issues, or where there have been perhaps incredible information of reprisals occurring in a particular context in the past. I think that's something you need to take into consideration to then sort of what type of risk management framework might be applicable, or indeed whether or not you might be able to undertake certain types of projects in those contexts. So I think that's one layer as well. The other is, of course, the grievance redress mechanism that Richard was mentioning. That needs to be robust and functional. And I think that's an area where we've done some studies ourselves and would acknowledge that those processes need to be strengthened more effectively and need to involve communities and have the grievance redress mechanisms more tailored to the cultural and context setting that they're being undertaken in. But there's a lot to be done on that to make them, truly effective. The other is, of course, recourse above a project or a client grievance redress mechanism through to ADB and then through to our accountability mechanism. So I think there's a number of levels that we need to go into in that process. So that's the kind of policy context. Maybe some of my colleagues might also be able to talk to you about some of the due diligence work that they do in some of our private sector projects to be able to manage issues. I see Mark's got his hand up, so he might want to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I just wanted to make a very quick comment about it's a very fundamental difference in our governance process during project selection from Sovereign. I have a team that focuses on integrity due diligence, we call it. When we are looking at a new client, there is a very detailed process we go through, very similar to commercial banks' know your client process. A key part of that is to do an analysis and searches to see what adverse media might be out there about our potential clients. And a key elements of that obviously are going to be human rights issues, labor issues. We also look at tax structuring and other such issues in determining the suitability of somebody to do business with, basically. So if we had a client that had a bad human rights record or other issues that we had concerns over, it may not be that we would automatically exclude them. We would probably make our initial approach as, okay, there have been these problems in the past. What have you done to correct this? And how can we be assured that it's not going to occur again? If we don't get the right answers at that stage, we'd probably decline to do business with them. So it's a fundamental part of what we do. And I think there's one other area that I'd like to highlight in more general terms about how ADB approaches its project selection and client selection. Up to about 4 or 5 years ago, our performance was measured on the number of dollars that went out of the door in our deals. We were then instructed by our board that we need to measure our performance differently. And our board wants us to look at the additionality and development impacts that our project bring, rather than the dollar size of each deal. So that's caused a very fundamental shift in how we undertake our project selection. And so part of the overall process, as I said, is we look at integrity due diligence, but also the development impacts and additionality that we're bringing. And I did make the point in my presentation that we expect our clients to be aligned with our visions and goals and all our policy requirements. And we won't do business with people who we feel are going to be dragging their feet or uncommitted on that front. We would decline to be involved with them. So that was one point I wanted to make on that. Can I also now go back to Jayastri's second question that he asked, which was about PSOD has grown quite considerably in the last 10 years. Where's the money gone, and what sectors are we investing in? I think there's two ways to answer this. I guess there's three key components to the private sector business here at ADB. Infrastructure remains a significant proportion of our portfolio, and the biggest component of that is renewable energy projects. You may have heard the ADB president has made a number of commitments in the last 12 months about our climate financing commitments and the fact that he wants ADB to be Asia's climate bank. That is clearly something that's going to be driving our project selection and portfolio development. We also have a very substantial part of our business is with our financial intermediaries. And the bulk of that money, if you want to call it that, or the work that we do with our FI clients is in microfinance, microcredit, and working with SMEs. We do have some clients who do bigger type of projects, but they're a very small proportion of our portfolio. So our financial intermediary portfolio is quite different to some of our other sister institutions, such as IFC, which has much larger transactions being handled by their financial intermediaries. The other area that we do work in is our equity and private equity fund business, but that's a fairly small proportion of the portfolio, and we're very selective about who we work with, and the development impact of those funds is one of the key decisions in triggering where the money goes. We have a couple of new teams that have come on board in the last couple of years. our agribusiness team, which is very keen on finding opportunities for more sustainable agriculture, for working with both private sector clients, but also contract farmers and communities that are feeding into those clients as well. And the other area we're very keen to develop more is our social sectors business, which looks at investments in health and education. But traditionally, we used to be known as the ADB was Asian Dams and Bridges, because we did so much infrastructure. And that's still very much a significant part of our portfolio, but changing very rapidly. So I hope that answers Jayastri's second question. I'm happy to go into more detail if required.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think you have given the things that I was looking for. Thank you very much.
And to Ashley, are there any follow-on clarifications that you require based on the responses that you've heard from Bruce and Mark?
Yes, just on two things. Thank you for that explanation, and it's good to hear that there is a requirement and you have a criteria through which you select the financial intermediaries and the clients you work with. One question is are these criteria publicly available? Is it accessible to others so they can know how these decisions are being made? And the other is on it slipped my mind. But well, just this one then.
Sure, actually, let me try and answer that very quickly. I don't have the precise answer, but I don't see why. We basically send a questionnaire out to our clients. I don't see why we couldn't share that questionnaire, but I will just have to double check with our lawyers to make sure that I'm giving you the right answer there. So let me get back to you on that. With regards to the human rights component to that and how detailed it is, I don't think probably in that questionnaire that we send to our clients it has that level of detail. I think the pickup point for that is there's so much information now available after various leaks and disclosures that the level of searches that we do, and it's not just a Google search, we use a lot of other databases and information sources to collate all the information. Human rights abuses and concerns, as I mentioned, would be a very significant red flag for us. And so I have a team of like nearly 30 consultants working on this. In the event that a client had issues like that, it would be considered a red flag. I think that's fairly fundamental. We don't have a very detailed list of thresholds and criteria at the moment. It's more like, if it's there, it's a problem.
All right. I think I remember what I wanted to ask next. I wanted to ask at what level of engagement does ADB have in the due diligence process that you require of your clients? My sense is that the clients have a stake in the project and they want the project to move forward. How do you, what sort of accountability do they have towards ADB?
Okay, so as I've mentioned before, we're quite selective who we work with, and providing they pass all those tests and they're keen to work with us, there's then I describe it as my department is the strings attached department. So as I say, we deal with safeguards, we deal with gender, we deal with integrity. So when we are working with our clients, we're explaining to them what commitments we expect from them, what we expect them to do just above and beyond taking the money and doing something with it, whether it's sort of general corporate finance or investing in a project. We have some very high expectations on them working with us, reporting to us, and that we monitor very closely what they're doing. So the legal framework that we put into our agreements and our finance documents means that we have quite a considerable amount of recourse, that if we feel that the client isn't performing, we can begin to turn the screws. The ultimate sanction would be to terminate the loan early. That's not something we do very lightly, but there are a number of other stages that we go through. One of the key processes that we want is to agree with our clients, what are the development outcomes we're trying to achieve in a project? And we agree with them on a number of indicators and outputs and outcomes that goes into a design and monitoring framework. And we expect them to report on that at least annually. And we monitor closely their progress against those targets and indicators. And if there's a problem, we sit down with them and say, right, what are you going to do about it? And likewise, if there's any unexpected events, whether it's sort of safeguard events or human rights issues, labor issues that crop up, we expect to be informed. And if we're not informed, my colleagues in the portfolio management division will get onto the client and ask why you are in breach of this part of your legal documents, and we want recourse and we want a corrective action plan in place. So we do have a lot of leverage, and we do work closely with our clients, and we use those instruments to ensure we're going in the direction we want.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Ashley and Mark for that, for the question and dialogue there. I think that was pretty rich dialogue, and definitely some insights into how ADB does business. I'm looking for any additional questions here. We do have a question that's been posted anonymously, which is regarding the gaps between the government and Indonesia policy and ADB's SPS with regard to replacement cost method evaluation for compensation. And this, the query goes on to talk about the Indonesian valuation standard in business-to-business processes, particularly for land acquisition, when it's done not in the public interest, has some gaps. And the query is around, how does ADB address this? I'm just going to see who within my team might be able to address that, but I'm also happy to just at a very high level, and what we can certainly do is look into this a little bit further. If we have any specific examples, I'll come back to you in writing. But for this particular question, to the anonymous question, we require our clients, especially within the private sector, if it's not a state-owned enterprise, of course, it's a little bit easier, but we, as part of the resettlement planning process, they are required to do a gap analysis of what the jurisdiction requirements are, and then to provide a methodology on how full replacement cost valuation is determined, and then identify specific gaps, and then it's on ADB to review that and determine if the proposed approach meets our determination of what full replacement cost might be. So and it's on the client to ensure that ADB's requirements are met. If they don't do that, then it's a non-compliance. I know there was some specific reference to sharecroppers and workers. I'm just going to see if Bruce, if there's anything you might want to add on top of what I've explained there. But as I say, we're happy to have a look at any specific cases on Indonesia. I think especially when it comes to state-owned enterprise, or whether we've worked with sharecroppers. Yeah. Or Felix. Thanks, or Bruce, Richard. Maybe. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Let me touch briefly, and I know Felix from our safeguards division can also come in on that. He works on resettlement issues across the region. But I was just recently in Indonesia with country consultations that we were doing there, and actually we did have discussions with both government and civil society around the gaps. I mean, that they're indeed real, as they are in many of the countries, particularly where we see differences in the way that replacement costs may be calculated, things like whether it includes depreciation of assets, for example. There's also differences with respect to addressing informal settlers, people without land title and the types of compensation, and whether users of natural resources would be covered for compensation, maybe people that are using and that they don't own, that would have either permanent or temporary restrictions, and cover how those issues would be covered. Now, our policy would require coverage of those issues. And so, as Richard has set out, we would do a gap analysis, we would do some due diligence around it, and then work with the client to start to address those issues. With the sharecropping aspect, I'm not really sure on exactly the context. Felix, I'm not sure if you've got any particular aspects that you might want to come in. I'm not aware of any project examples where sharecropping has come into an issue, but there may be. Anything that you'd like to add?
Exactly, Bruce. Not specific one, and if I do, Richard, who are in the private sector that we work very closely with, both of us should be aware. None that has come on my radar, and I know this question came in quite anonymously. What I will urge the author of the question will be, if he or she can provide some more background information, we may be able to provide some more detailed response to that. But just to add up to what Richard and yourself have provided, and more than talk about the loopholes or weaknesses within the valuation approach, I'd like to look at maybe the scenarios where we're likely to have this under a private sector transaction. So Richard has mentioned there where we have a state-owned enterprise. I see B2B, and Richard, you explained that to be business to business. So where we have a state-owned enterprise, maybe with a private client, a private sector client procuring the land, maybe we could have that issue. But we could also have it when we have a business-to-business land acquisition adopting the negotiated settlement approach, where we have maybe other people using the land. It could be informal settlers, you've mentioned in there. It could be people using the land on temporary basis, where one business who could potentially be ADB may identify another prospective business and may not necessarily recognize people using the right and not having formal title ownership of the land. And the country requirement may not necessarily address economic displacement issue. That is likely. But even with that one, the way we conduct our due diligence with our private sector operations requires that somebody may have gone into that place, may have had a look at the site, and if there are any economic activities or informal use of the land within that, it would have been picked up. So I would urge the one who provided a question to throw some bit more information into the background, and then we'll be able to provide some detailed response to it. It could be land acquisition, because I can see valuation has been mentioned, but if it has to be with labor and working conditions, because I can also see workers being mentioned, he can provide some background and we could respond to the person accordingly. Over to you, Mark. Richard.
Great, thanks, Felix. Just as a reminder to everyone, we have around 20 minutes remaining for this particular Q&A session. So if there are any questions from the participants, now's your chance. So I'll open the floor again and see if we can invite anyone to pose a question. Okay, so we have actually two questions that just came in. So we've got a question from Ashley McDonald. I think you've posted another question. If you mind, I'll allow you to go first, and then Jayasri, actually, I've just spotted another question that you raised about labour as well, and forming the lack of dialogue with global union federations. So I might ask you to talk about that a little bit as well. So Ashley, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm just making use of the time. A query here is, how does ADB track all the financial intermediaries and equity investments in their projects? And how are the common people and the communities that are impacted going to know that these projects are in fact funded by ADB? Is that publicly shared information?
Thanks, Ashley. Mark, I'll let you. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. how do people know that financial intermediaries have provided money from ADB? That's a good question. I guess it's not something that we have a big communications campaign with a particular client in a particular region to say, here is ADB funding through this institution. It's normally more to do with, okay, we are looking for suitable partners to work with in our countries, and there's a whole heap of questions that we will be asking. Okay, what sort of products are you wanting to offer to people in your region? Do they align with ADB requirements? Is it women? Is there a big focus on women and other affected people? Is it people who are excluded from the financial markets and financial inclusion at the moment? Are you working on bringing those into the financial system? So that is how we would select a client. Once we have selected it, the clients, it's their product and their marketing that is telling people, we have this available for you. Once we are working with a client, how do we track the investment and how do we track its performance? As with all our other investments, all our clients are required to report to us. So we will have a 6 monthly or annual report from our client that will be telling us how much they've lent to who and what for. The real issue comes now with the transparency and disclosure of those reports that we receive. And the real conundrum that we face is, particularly with our FI clients, if we publish those reports unredacted or uncensored or unedited, what we're doing is giving their competitors a list of their clients. And so they're obviously very concerned about that and do not want us to disclose that information publicly. We have looked at other ways of trying to present the information that doesn't give the name of the clients and any other identifying features, and the reports do become pretty meaningless. So it's still something that we're wrestling with, and I know there's a lot of interest in the wider community as to how we can improve that. I don't have any quick answers at the moment because it's a difficult one to deal with, but rest assured that our financial intermediaries and our equity partners are treated in exactly the same way as our project finance clients. Everybody is required to report, and we do monitor the effectiveness of what they're delivering. And depending on the sensitivity of the client and their projects, we can undertake site visits, work with them, do audits, etc. Back to Bruce.
Yeah, Richard, I just wanted to come in a little bit more on Ashley's point. Mark's covered a little bit of the sort of project level tracking, but Ashley, I just wanted to make clear that for all of the projects that ADB approves, anything that goes to our board, that is disclosed on our website. And we do have a database where you can actually search based on the type of financing, the type of sector, the countries that we invest in, all of the projects. And all of the individual projects do have what we call a data sheet, which provides information on, what the project's about, who the client is, how much financing is channeled. So those data sheets will have information about, let's say, ADB's approved financing to a particular financial intermediary, how much that is, what's it for. And then the project documents include also information on the environmental and social due diligence that's undertaken before we approve that. For example, if they have an environmental and social management system, whether there are gaps in that system in comparison to ADB requirements, and if there's any gap filling measures that would need to be put in place. That framework and all of that information would be disclosed. And then Mark's sort of spoken a little bit in terms of the monitoring report requirements. And I think that is an issue where we're debating how to provide a framework that respects and addresses some legitimate commercial confidentiality issues with providing, robust and transparent reporting. So just wanted to give you that wider context. And if you have any further thoughts, just please feel free to come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Tendría que tenemos la última hora en el informe
Thank you.
Yeah, hi there. Sorry, I think we got some cross wires there. But yeah, Ashley, any requests for further clarification?
Thank you. No further clarification, just like a thought maybe is just this kind of limits the previous thing you shared, Bruce, about taking the supporting the impacted communities, how they reach the grievance mechanism and how they reach ADB beyond the client. Where can they go to access remedy? And they would come to you. And not having that information and not knowing where the money flows into their intermediaries, the communities may not be able to reach out to you directly. Just a thought.
I agree. That is a good point. But I go back to what I was describing earlier about our private sector FI portfolio, and the majority of the clients that we have and the work that they do is focused on microcredit, microfinance, SME type work. So we would not expect to have a lot of very complex and sensitive issues arising from that lending. We do have a few clients who do the big infrastructure projects with ADB funding. The Indonesia Infrastructure Fund is one example, and we've had to work for a number of years with them very closely to ensure that they actually do disclose what they're lending and whose money is behind it, and helping them to get their systems and processes in place so that they are disclosing that publicly. Are the grievance redress mechanisms up to standard? I can't comment on that because I'm not very familiar with that project, but I think our overall view is that we still have work to be done on GRMs, and getting that message across to people that if you have a problem or you're affected by one of ADB's funded projects, this is how you deal with it. So yeah, we'll continue to work on that.
Thank you.
Just a quick one to add again. So requirements for financial intermediaries, equity funds, or other types of projects with finance would be to ensure that there's grievance redress mechanisms at a project level, but consistent with the type of financing that they do. So obviously, that very small microfinance down to, small business loans for women's community be very different to a larger infrastructure project. So the GRM has to be fit for purpose. But that would be a requirement for them to cascade that down at the project level if that's the type of investments they're doing. Also, ADB does have its accountability mechanism, and something that we're looking to see if we can make clearer is in terms of having through the project GRM that it's clear for affected people that if they've not been able to get satisfactory recourse, that ADB is involved in the transaction and there is the accountability mechanism. So that's something further. And in the new policy framework, we're proposing to develop more specific, what you might call sort of agreements with the client or the lender, environmental and social commitment plans, which can include commitments around the establishment of these types of mechanisms. So, the project should have it. And then the last thing to mention, Mark said a couple of times that in the private sector portfolio at the moment, we do have smaller types of investments, but we do have arrangements in the policy that if there are larger infrastructure investments with a private sector client, even if it's through a financial intermediary, that would trigger category A, our higher risk projects, that they would have to take those environmental impact assessments, or if it was a more significant, say, impact on land, they would have to take all that documentation back through ADB for review and clearance and have it disclosed consistent, including 120 days on ADB's website based on the current policy. So it's a little bit differentiated based on the type of risk.
Great, thanks, Bruce and Mark.
Great, thanks, thanks, Bruce, for elaborating. Yeah, I mean, you know, my own experience with working with FIs, just to provide a bit more sort of meat on the bones, is that we do include the requirement for a grievance mechanism in our due diligence. And again, as Bruce said, it depends on how many staff members they might have, or what kind of project and risk, what kind of risk profiles presented. But we do require our lenders to have, you know, if it's a small team, a borrower with a small team, say 10, 20 office workers working on a tech platform, for example, then we would request that they have an internal workers grievance mechanism up and running. And that one of the things that they report to us internally is on a semi-annual or annual basis is a copy or summary of the grievance log, so that we can track what kind of grievances are being registered, if any, and the status as well. And if there are unresolved grievances, then we'll dig into that a little bit further with the client to find out what's going on and what kind of steps they're taking to resolve those in a reasonable amount of time. So yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna point participants to a response to that anonymous query that we had, where we've got one of our ADB specialists who has some experience with sharecroppers. So you might see that, which Bruce kindly posted for us. So hopefully that responds adequately to the query. But please, if you require any more information around this particular issue, please let us know by email. That's no problem. I'm just going to see if there are any more queries or questions, recognizing that I think we only have limited time remaining. Yeah, so Jennifer, one of my colleagues, has also just posted some information just in response to the level of transparency that you might see from some borrowers and clients who deal with private equity funds. So there's some examples there that you can take a look at as well. I think Ashley, you might be interested in that in particular. Yeah. Great. Okay. Okay. If nobody's raising their hands, there was one other question that I just wanted to pull up, which I didn't spot initially, which again was from Jayasri, and it was about ADB's engagement with labour unions and a suggestion that you made. Jayasri, do you want to elaborate that one, and we'll see how we might respond to that if you're still online.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. We had been engaging with various project evaluations, and then we have found certain shortcomings in various areas, and we have brought that to the notice of ADB. But my special focus on this question was now when we are dealing with the private sector, there is very little room for trade unions to make any representations, or and then there aren't any trade unions who are active in most of the private sector entities. But nevertheless, now, I mean, from the explanations that we received, the ADB is now making a fundamental shift, like the other IFIs, just to emphasize on, say, what you call the performance standards, and then giving them as a guidelines for the borrowers. And then I also see that you are also very specific about the development objectives and the measuring indicators. So when these things are known to many of the trade unions and then the other stakeholders, they will be in a better position to monitor even the private sector lending to see whether they meet the desired objective. So I hope, I mean, my question was basically to prompt on that, because we see most in the local, the projects, when the ADB and the ADB staff going for evaluation, there is the consultation between the trade unions are very, very little, and that has to be improved so that we can also contribute effectively in achieving the ADB's goal. So this is the point that I really want to emphasize here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jayashree. Bruce, I don't know if you've got a quick response to Jayashree's query about engagement with trade unions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Jayashree. Maybe I can respond a little bit broadly, and then if you have some follow-up more specifics, we can come to that. Firstly, we've had a lot of trade union involvement in this consultation process, which has been useful, and groups like Builders and Woodworkers International, the ITUC, and many others have been in the process. And actually, with some, we're now looking at some more strategic engagement. Actually, we're working on an MOU with BWI with a view to see how we can share knowledge and collaborate into the future. So that's moving forward. That comes off the back of a proposal from us that we would include now within this new policy framework a standard on labour and working conditions, which would be broadly aligned with what you see from some of the other MDBs. The IFC, the World Bank, others have got standards on labour and working conditions, whereas ADB had an older social protection strategy from 2001, which did include kind of more aspirational objectives around the core labour standards. So child labour, forced labour, freedom of association and collective bargaining, those four main areas were highlighted there. But now with this new policy framework, we'll have a standard, we'll bring those core labour standards, but also a broader approach on working conditions in. So that would be expected to be followed by our borrowers and clients, again, consistent with the types of impacts from a project that would be there. And of course, larger scale investments would require more sophisticated labour management plans. So I guess there would be in the future more entry points perhaps for unions to look at, what are some of the issues around labour force participation and, maybe the role of workers in looking at health and safety issues on site or even engagement with unions. But I think that's something we'll have to look at more in the implementation stage. That's broad answer. Maybe you had some more specific points or questions in mind.
Thanks, Bruce. I know because we also work very closely with BWI and ITUC, and we collaborate with them. So aside this only, we came up with the other suggestions like what we have proposed to improve further areas of cooperation and collaboration. So this is a welcome move, and then we really appreciate the ADB's initiating to bring the labor and working condition aspects. That's a very, very good sign. So this is hopefully when we move forward with as you said, moving into the performance standards kind of thing, there will be many areas for us to work together. And so thank you. I'm hopeful, and let's see how we can bring this forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jess. That's really appreciated.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jayashree. Thanks, Bruce. So again, I think we have 2 or 3 minutes remaining. So what I'll do is just open the floor and encourage participants to raise any remaining questions, or maybe the final 1 or 2 questions, depending what the response is like. So please raise your hand or post a message in the chat group. Again, these can be raised anonymously as well. There's a function within the chat group to do that. No, that's absolutely fine, and we'll do the best we can to respond. Okay. Okay, so I think we've run out of questions, and that's fine because time is almost up anyway on this particular section. But please, to all participants, if anything comes to mind sort of after this discussion or as a response or reflection on some of the things that you've heard from other participants and from my colleagues here at ADB, please feel free to submit by email as before, and we'll endeavour to respond to those. And as you heard at the outset, we'll be sharing a summary of the consultations at a later point. So yeah, what I'll do then is I'll hand back to Gelson, if you don't mind, and I'll thank everyone for your time and patience today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And to our respondents from ADB, Bruce, Mark, and more importantly, thank you to our civil society participants for your comments and specific questions. They've been substantive, and we hope that we provided some clarity. These are also being taken into account as ADB starts reflecting on the range of feedback we received from many stakeholder consultations so far, and this then will feed into the drafting of a new policy. But please don't go yet. I see we already have the questions flash on your screen, and that the question is about, rating your satisfaction with today's sessions. The aim here is for us to get a better sense of how we fare in the way we handle the consultation and what can be improved further for our next rounds of consultations. There are more to come next year as we enter the phase 3 of our safeguards policy review and update process. So please, we'd like your feedback. You can simply click which number best suits your assessment of the consultation. And then there's also a question in Menti where you can feel free to share specific recommendations and comments that you have not been able to articulate during the question time. And this will still be captured by my colleague, Jen. All right, I'm not sure, Jen, if we can start flashing the results on screen. All right, so I think we have a fairly good responses. It shows that most of the respondents provided us with a fairly high mark, if you can put it that way, somewhat satisfied and highly satisfied in this consultation. I hope that we can keep that consistency for the next 2 rounds of private sector operations. But of course, we also welcome your feedback on the specific areas where we feel we could do better. And of course, it's an invitation to our participants, hopefully who will be joining tomorrow from the other regions, to also start preparing some questions and comments so far. So on that note, I will now turn you over back to Bruce to provide us a synthesis of what we have heard and that what the next steps are, especially as we look forward for phase 3 of the review process next year. Over to you, Bruce.
Great, thank you very much, Gelson. And firstly, big thanks to everyone that's joined today. Appreciate that it's a fairly small group that we've had today, and maybe a small range of people that were contributing directly in the discussion. But I'm pleased that for the wider group that have joined today, that you found, at least based on the evaluation, you found that it was a useful session for you. Certainly always very useful for us to just highlight some of the key issues that you're thinking about and that we need to think about more. I found that some of the key points coming out were firstly around the business and human rights aspects and how ADB is looking at human rights issues already, and how we can look more specifically at those issues as we try to integrate it both within the policy framework, but also in things like contextual analysis and human rights due diligence that we may do to understand the context under which projects are operating. I think we've been hearing about this actually quite consistently through the consultations and recognise it as an important issue. We also recognise the needs to look at governance issues, as part of that. I think you've got a whole range of issues that Mark's mentioned that we look at in things like integrity, due diligence, but also the wider governance framework and context under which a project is being developed in. The governance situation within a particular country context is also relevant and something that we are looking at, as well as the particular client's performance, track record, and capacity. That they're all very critical aspects. Mark spoke about some of them. Also, somewhat linked to the human rights issues, but also on a wider frame is the whole issue of stakeholder engagement, meaningful consultation, grievance redress mechanisms, and making sure that that's effective and free of reprisals. And then we went into a discussion there around grievance redress mechanisms and how to make those effective. And you had questions also about how are those integrated by private sector clients, including financial intermediaries. We explained a little bit around how that's cascaded down and made consistent with the scope of the project and how significant the risks would be. But this is an area we need to do a lot more work on to make GRMs effective and to make them, I think, tailored to the cultural context. That's another issue that's been coming up a lot in the consultations, for example, around working with Indigenous peoples or working with particular vulnerable and disadvantaged groups that might exist in some project areas, or looking at gender issues. It didn't come up explicitly today, but we are looking, and ADB now has a guidance note we've been developing around addressing risks of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment in projects. So grievance redress mechanisms also need to be customized around dealing with those types of issues. So these are things that we're working on. And then we also touched on, just towards the end, labour and working conditions and engagement with trade unions. That is an area, and as we develop up the standard on labour and working conditions and make that available, I'm sure we'll have further comments from you and other colleagues in the future. And then we had some discussion around information disclosure, which Mark also clarified, and we did include one example in the chat there. But as mentioned before, do have a look at ADB's. We have a portal on projects where you can also do searches and find data sheets with information, including disclosures. And if anyone would like further assistance or guidance on that, please do let us know. So that's a quick summary on some of the topics we've covered today, but we will be having further consultations on this topic. We're covering different time zones. So actually tomorrow in the morning, Manila time, I think 10 a.m. Manila time, we will have another consultation on the same topic. And then tomorrow evening, Manila time, catering to those that are in the United States, Canada, and Europe, we'll run a third session. So if you have colleagues interested to join, feel free to spread the word on that and ask them to register. And then moving forward, as I said in the beginning, the time schedule for the whole update may shift a little bit. We were aiming to have the first draft of the policy available by January this year, so that we could then go into firstly disclosure of that, and then getting further feedback from stakeholders in advance of a board meeting on the draft in March. We're expecting to push that back now by approximately 3 months. So letting stakeholders know more information about that on our website, as well as with email information to registered stakeholders. In the meantime, though, I really greatly appreciate your inputs, all helping us to think through the issues and develop a better, more rounded policy for the ADB. So thanks again and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.